Good morning. Welcome all to the third of our Disrupting Disadvantage event series. And today we're looking at disruptive events. And I give you greetings from Melbourne, where we're specialising in exactly the same. But first, of course, I'm keen to acknowledge country, to say that I'm here with you today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, who've been the custodians of this land for thousands of years. And I acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders past and present. And we're joined by guests today on the lands of the Gadigal, the Yalia, the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong nations, amongst others. So let us acknowledge elders past and present from all of those and say thank you for this, for being on your country. We are still living amidst the deep disruption of last year's events and this, the Black Saturday summer of bushfires in 2019-20, the arrival of COVID-19 in Australia. These have sparked large-scale social policy responses out of the experience of almost all of us. And here we are coming toward the end of 2021, and our lives are still turned around very much by pandemic and by current events. And we're all cognizant, I know, of how these crises affect in particular the experience of communities living with disadvantage across Australia. So I'm really delighted that this morning we have a chance to hear from leaders from both Australia and overseas who are going to share their insights and reflections on the last 18 months, raise the questions which they're grappling, and give you a chance to ask questions and, in a sense, join the conversation, which is really important. Please do note that this event is being recorded, and there's a Q&A function for our audience to pose questions to the keynote speaker and the panel. And please do so, because although this is not an ideal technology for conversations, it's how we have to work. So we're going to make the absolute best of it. And I want to jump straight in and introduce our keynote speaker, and with thanks for his time and willingness to be part of this morning. The Commissioner, Shane Fitzsimons, AFSM, he's going to begin our event with a keynote address. And Commissioner Fitzsimons was recently appointed as the inaugural Commissioner for Resilience New South Wales within the Department of Premier and Cabinet. This appointment, of course, followed an incredibly distinguished career with the New South Wales Rural Fire Service of more than 35 years. Commissioner Fitzsimons is the recipient of the Australian Fire Service Medal. He's instantly recognisable to residents of New South Wales and beyond for his leadership and coordination of the state's response to the Black Summer bushfires. And we're delighted that he's joined us today to deliver the keynote address. So would you please welcome Commissioner Shane Fitzsimons.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for that wonderful and warm welcome. Can I too acknowledge country and recognise that I'm on the lands of the Darug and the Guringai people in the northern outskirts of Sydney, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and of course to their heritage and their custodianship of the lands and the waterways in which we live and enjoy today. Being able to join you today was truly an honour, and being asked to reflect just a little on my insights and experiences, particularly over the last 18 months or so, and through the establishment of the new organisation, Resilience New South Wales. Our organisation was established effective on the 1st of May of 2020, so we're only 15, 16 months ago set up as an organisation. It came on the back of what was an unprecedented fire season for the state of New South Wales, resulting in considerable damage and destruction, dislocation, and significant impact and effect on communities right across the state, from the Queensland border right down to the Victorian border along the Great Dividing Range, but also to all that were involved in the response, coordination, and the ongoing recovery, rebuilding and healing process. But when I reflect on the last 18 months or so, I think we've got to go back a little more and put into context the extraordinary implications and effects of compounding and successive disasters that have befallen so many people, not just across New South Wales but elsewhere, but from my perspective, particularly the state of New South Wales. And if we go back to the lead-in to the 2019-20 fire season, 100% of the state of New South Wales was drought declared and drought affected. People were living through one of the worst droughts in centuries, and there was already profound impacts and effects on communities right across the state. Those extremely dry conditions, dominated by a weather pattern that just continued to deliver above average temperatures and below average rainfall, meant that we started seeing significant fire activity right through and leading into the spring and summer periods. I won't use the phrase black summer bushfires because I think it does a disservice to so many communities, so many families, so many businesses that were heavily impacted and suffered extraordinary loss well ahead of hitting summer. As a matter of fact, more than 1,000 fires a month were being experienced during winter, resulting in considerable effort and considerable response across the state and from our colleagues around the state. Conditions just intensified as we went into the spring and summer months, and tragically, the resultant bushfire period saw more than 5.5 million hectares destroyed, environments and ecosystems, but of course livelihoods, businesses, homes, communities, schools and other infrastructure were damaged and or destroyed right across communities along the Great Dividing Range. One of the most profound losses was the loss of 26 lives, including 7 firefighters, 4 volunteers, and 3 aircrew that were working as part of the firefighting effort, who died whilst they were out saving and protecting others from the onset of the disasters. And behind all of those statistics, whether it's 2,500 homes destroyed, significant community infrastructure, power infrastructure, utilities, roads, networks, behind every data set, there are people. There are individuals, there are families, there are children, there are businesses, there are communities that are left to pick up the pieces. Coming out of the bushfires, literally in the February period of 2020, when the dry weather cycle finally broke, we saw extraordinary rainfall and storm events that across a denuded landscape, communities and areas affected by the drought and affected by the fires were now experiencing significant storms, significant rainfall, erosion, washaways. So whatever they were able to protect and keep as a result of those fires and drought, they were now finding, many of them, that it was being washed away through another weather event. We came out of February 2020 storms and floods and weather events, and very quickly as we moved into March and April, we were starting to experience the profound implications of responding to and managing through the COVID-19 pandemic that was impacting New South Wales, Australia, and around the world. The compounding effect of the COVID outbreak meant so many of the significant recovery and healing operations or events and activities that were being planned to support those communities was now compromised and exacerbated even further challenges in communities trying to pick up the pieces and rebuild their lives and rebuild their town, rebuild their community. COVID dominated throughout 2020. And then, of course, as we turned into 21, everyone was looking for more optimism and a better year than what we'd experienced in 2020, only to find that in March of 21, we saw again significant rainfall events and flooding events that affected lots of areas of northwestern Sydney, the north coast and mid-north coast of New South Wales, resulting in significant dislocation, impact and effect to communities, lots of inundation, lots of isolation. As a matter of fact, more than 60% of the local government areas declared natural disasters for the flood events in March of this year were also declared natural disaster areas for the fires. So you've got this really profound and ongoing compounding effect. And then, of course, as we came out of March and started to work and support so many people with the floods, we then experienced in the middle of this year the onset of the Delta strain of the COVID pandemic and all that's come with that in terms of significant loss, significant implication, the resultant activities, actions, decisions that have had an effect on communities right across the geographic footprint of the state, and of course, as we know, in other parts of Australia as well. Throw in there a mouse plague, one of the worst they've seen in decades in some of those same communities, and of course an exponential growth in cyber activity and cyber crime and ransomware and other things. It doesn't take much to recognise that communities at all levels have been profoundly affected by uncertainty, by disruption, by damage, and indeed by loss over the last 18 months or so. So Resilience New South Wales was established as an organisation to lead from prevention through to recovery, lifting and providing confidence to communities across the state to live, work and invest. Our role is to lead and coordinate disaster management and recovery, to drive strategies and investments, to reduce risk, to build resilience of communities to significant external shocks and stresses of all kinds. We knew the fire season was unprecedented, so the inception of the agency under statute was to make sure we took a whole of government, whole of community approach to coordinating the very best we could, recovery, rebuilding, repair, reconstruction, and importantly healing as a result of the unprecedented fire season. And of course you would expect an equivalent, unparalleled, unprecedented level of approach and investment to supporting communities with that recovery effort following the fires. And then since we've been established, we've seen the compounding effects of those other disasters coming on top of bushfire impacted communities requiring support and assistance. When I first accepted the role to head up Resilience New South Wales, it wasn't introduced to me as an agency that was going to be called Resilience New South Wales. It was going to be called something like Disaster and Emergency Management New South Wales. And as someone with a background in fire and emergency services, that made a bit of sense to me. And I remember having a conversation with the Premier and the Minister and the head of the public service. And I said, where the bloody hell did this word resilience come from? No one's going to relate to it. No one's going to connect to it. No one's going to know what it means. And the reassurance was, no, it's going to be more than that. We need to be very proactive in a preventative and an analytical way, but also be quite responsive and agile and leading recovery and relief arrangements in the event that the events happen. So in the last 15, 16 months particularly, I've done a lot of reflecting, I've done a lot of listening, I've done some reading on what is resilience when it comes to an organisation like Resilience New South Wales. One thing I have learned, I don't adopt the simple definition that pops up in most dictionaries, and that is often, and I'm paraphrasing, simply saying we bounce back to normal after a big event or a big disaster. Firstly, I don't know what bouncing back to normal actually is, normal in inverted commas, after you've just lived through a pretty traumatic experience or a difficult time. And then why on earth would anyone want to go back to where they were before being so heavily impacted and affected to experience it all again? And as I've travelled around, I think resilience is really about lived experiences. It's about learning from lived experiences. It's about learning from those lived experiences and doing things differently, coming out stronger, wiser, better for those challenges and those experiences, so that we're better able to anticipate, identify, prepare, seek to mitigate, or indeed prevent if possible, but ready ourselves to be able to endure the next event. And when we come out of that event, that we come out more learned, that we come out with better insights, better improvements, and that we become more resilient. We become better for that experience, so that we're better able to endure the next one. I think the US Psych Association described it pretty well, where they likened resilience to a journey on a raft or a canoe going down a river, and that we find ourselves in life's journey sometimes being on wonderful, tranquil waters, pleasant waters where the serenity and the amenity is just lovely. But what we might also find as we journey that river is that we'll come across some turbulent water, we'll come across some snags, we might even come across the odd set of rapids, and we be bumped around a bit, we might be bruised, we might find ourselves needing to adjust and adapt new skills and techniques. We might find as we go through one set of rapids or one set of areas that we need to modify and improve and enhance our raft or our canoe so it's better able to withstand the next one. So I think lived experiences, life experiences is really important. But as I travelled around and spent time with individuals, with families, at schools, listening and talking to people, what I also learned, that resilience is about strength. It is about courage. It is about learning through those life experiences. But for some reason, as a culture, we tend to overlook the other really important aspect when it comes to lived experiences and building resilience. And that is that through those lived experiences, there is invariably a significant emotional and psychological toll that's occasioned. And whether that's through living through the event and your role in that event or that disaster, or indeed when it's coming out the other side and contemplating where to from here, how on earth do I pick up the pieces, where do I start, what next, what to come. So the overwhelming nature of what's before us. And for some reason, as society, as communities, as a culture, we tend just to not speak about those things. And I remember so vividly having a couple of stories, a couple of conversations that I can share in a story. Traveling home one night, talking to a former colleague, we were reflecting on the anniversary of the death of one of our fellow firefighters. It was tragic. It was extraordinary. And this conversation 12 months on, it was emotional. There were tears at both ends of the phone. And I said to him, I said, are you still getting support? And he said, yes, I am. I said, is it helping? He said, absolutely. He said, I didn't realize how much I was shutting up my wife. I didn't realize how much I was ignoring the kids and not spending time with them. And I didn't realize how short I was or incomplete I was being in the workplace, putting up a facade. He said, but it's really helping me, and I'm reconnecting and I'm feeling stronger and I'm feeling more confident. I said, that's great, keep going. He said, yes, I will. And then as we finished the conversation, he said to me, before you go, Shane, he said, can you promise me something? I said, what's that? He said, can you promise me you won't tell anybody? I said, I won't tell anyone what? He said, can you promise me you won't tell anyone that I'm getting help? And I was completely floored by the conversation, because here's an individual who's done a remarkable amount for his community, lived through an extraordinary emotional and tragic time, was getting support, getting assistance, who conceded it was making a massive difference in his life and the lives of those around him that mattered most. And I said, why? Why don't you want me to share this? He said, because I don't want to be judged. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I don't want people to judge me and think that I'm not strong. I don't want people to judge me and think that I'm not coping. And he said, most importantly, I don't want people to judge me and think that I'm not capable of coming back to work, because coming back to work and continuing to contribute really matters in my life. And I reflected on that enormously. But then I also reflected on the conversations that I was having when I visited people at their home, around the kitchen table, at the local pub, having a counter lunch or a quiet beer, or indeed at some of the community meetings. And the amount of people that would say to me, Shane, can someone talk to my folks? Can someone talk to my husband? Can someone talk to my neighbour? Can someone talk to X down the road? They've got not much left. I don't know how they're going to go forward and pick up the pieces. They won't talk to anybody. They certainly won't put their hand up for support, because they think there's people worse off than them that are more deserving than them. And their plea was, I really don't want them to give up on hope. I don't want them to think that they can't go on. I don't want them to think that they can't pick up the pieces. And I remember sitting down with a young couple where the husband particularly was adamant that they weren't going to put their hand up, that his father and his grandfather and those before them were able to pick up the pieces after natural disasters or big events on the property, and they could rebuild and they could renew. And he was adamant that he had to do it because there was some sort of hand down from generations that this is how things were done. But after seeing sense through the advice of his wife, they put up their hand for what they were eligible for and entitled to, a small assistance grant that would help them make decisions in business. And they accepted that. And he sat there and he said to me, he said, I was bloody minded, Shane. He said, I was adamant that we could do this without support. I thought there was stigma and shame in reaching out and conceding that I wasn't going too well, that I was worried about how we were going to take the next step and how we were going to get on with renewing our business and renewing the property. He said, but this grant has made a massive difference to him and his wife. They were having more measured and considered conversations. They were able to weigh up their priorities more readily. They were able to make decisions that meant they got the balance right between the property, the business, their livelihoods, but also the kids back in school. And my plea out of those sorts of experiences is, and particularly to people like me, middle-aged white guys, we've got the biggest lifting to do, in my view. This male macho BS culture that's been handed down through generations that somehow resilience is just about strength and moving forward, and pretending that we're not all challenged by uncertainty, by being overwhelmed, by being challenged by contemplating how on earth do we pick up the pieces and go forward, or indeed whether it's just what we've experienced being so unsettling or indeed so traumatic. The sooner we can start giving ourselves permission, the sooner we can start giving each other permission to reach out and connect with one another, to reach out and concede that just like everybody else, we've got thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And those thoughts, feelings, and emotions are what drive so often our decisions, that just drive so often our behaviours and our interactions with others, particularly those that matter most, the loved ones and the family members at home, but also our neighbours and our mates and our communities. The more we can give each other permission, the more we'll realise and see through one another that we are normal, that we are human, and that surprisingly, once we start sharing some of those thoughts and feelings, and indeed apprehensions or uncertainties, we will realise that the person we see across the way who looks strong and resilient, and we think that they don't have the same sort of emotional burdens that we're carrying, they will realise that they actually do. Indeed, we all do. So the more we can open up and connect and talk with one another, I think the stronger and healthier and more resilient and more able to adapt and overcome and share in the challenges. Challenges shared are more readily solutions found will be. I often rely on children, I think, to be the solid voice of reason because they're so unfiltered, they're so raw. And there's two things I would like to leave you with. Number one, never underestimate the value of the little things that we all do for ourselves, and more importantly, I suspect, for one another, how much of a difference they can make. When my daughters were little, I used to love reading this little book called Who Sank the Boat by Pam Allen. It's a book about a donkey, a pig, a cow, I think it is. There's four animals, a sheep, and a little mouse that have got to get into this boat, and they've got to get across the waterway. And as each animal settles into the boat, every time you turn the page, the boat settles in the water, it goes a little bit lower in the water, and the question is asked, do you know who sank the boat? And all the big animals get in. And then it's right at one of the last pages that the little mouse decides to hop in the boat to complete the crew and go paddling across the water. But as the mouse jumps in the boat, it's the mouse that capsizes the boat, and they all end up in the water. I'm sure there's a real solid child lesson learning in there around volumes and metrics and all those sorts of things. But for me, there's profound life leadership lessons there. We should never underestimate the importance of the little things. We should never underestimate the significance of the little things that might play on our mind. But we should also, as individuals and as community members, never underestimate the value of the little things that can make a difference for you and for others. The reach out with a message, the reach out with a phone call, the reach out with a conversation, the check in, how people are traveling. Are you okay? It's perfectly okay not to be, but it's also perfectly okay to be okay. But the more we can share those little things, our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings, we might find even more so how joined up we are. And this was profoundly reinforced for me when I visited the Cobargo Public School towards the end of 2020, spending time with kids and indeed the teachers and the carers, and reflecting on what they'd done. They'd put together a wonderful book sharing their stories, their reflections, their journey through their darkest of times. Some of the kids lost family members. Most of the kids lost property and livelihood aspects in their environment. But what came through the Cobargo Public School and came through when I visited other schools and other community groups up across the Great Dividing Range that were fire affected, there were three little phrases that kept coming out consistently, slightly different wording, but generally speaking, it centered around three phrases. When kids opened up and spoke with one another and they reflected on their learnings through doing that, the first thing they realized was, I am not alone. The kids realized when they started talking together that they weren't alone in their experiences, they weren't alone in their thoughts, and they weren't alone in their feelings, and they weren't alone in their worries. And then what they also realized, talking to their mates, was that you are not alone. So they were able to reassure their mates that they weren't alone. So I am not alone, you are not alone. But then as groups, as kids, as classes, they worked out that we are not alone. And I think those profound learnings out of our young ones remind us that together, if we open, if we share, if we reflect, and if we work out ideas and solutions going forward, we will realize that individually and collectively, we can make a difference. We can learn through adversity. We can learn through disasters and challenges and utilize those experiences to come out wiser, to come out stronger, to see betterment in investment, in infrastructure, to see betterment in investment and changes to programs and systems that don't just put us back to where we were before we were affected and disrupted by the most recent event, but how do we better ready ourselves and prepare ourselves to be able to withstand and grow out the other side and anticipate those future events going forward. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I look forward to participating in today's discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner Fitzsimons, for some really profound reflections on the emotional and psychological toll of crisis and the fact that the consequences far outlive the dramatic moment, and they are about people and people's ability to help each other and to support themselves. Of course, you'll have lots of interesting questions from the audience. So can I remind you, the Ask a Question button is open and please use it. But while you think of your question, it's a delight just to introduce a very short segment. Professor David Hunter is the Richard Dole Professor of Epidemiology and Medicine and the Director of the Harvard-Oxford Program in Epidemiology. He's a respected science communicator in Australia and overseas. And during this pandemic, he's used his academic platforms to communicate quite complex epidemiological data to inform the public's approach to infection management and vaccination, which has been on all of our minds. He's in the United Kingdom, but he has recorded just a few opening remarks with which to frame our panel discussion. So please welcome Professor David Hunter.
Hi there. I'd like to thank the organizers and the Ramsay Foundation for asking me to make a few brief remarks at your session on disruption. As an epidemiologist, of course, the COVID pandemic has been the biggest worldwide disruption in my professional lifetime. And it has disrupted more than just our hospital systems and our trade and travel and economies. It's really disrupted in many countries our sense of selves, revealing deep inequalities in society, who gets infected, how, who gets treated. And from a global health perspective, it's really disrupted our sense of global solidarity. We always used to think that if this happened and a vaccine became available, we'd be able to rapidly develop that vaccine and get it to the countries that needed it around the world. But as we've seen, people in developed countries, most of you perhaps, have been single or double jabbed, but we're still only running about 5% vaccination in places like Africa. And even our healthcare colleagues are still dying because we haven't been able to get the vaccine to them on time. That's really a failure of will. And I think it will come back to haunt us when we hopefully resume some version of normality and have to look at our colleagues in other countries in the eye. COVID has also shown that we've really built the resilience out of healthcare systems, even in developed countries. We've switched to a just-in-time model of healthcare, closing wards, trying to limit hospital stays, for good reasons often. But it's meant that when something like this happens, we have no surge capacity of beds, particularly ICU beds. We have little surge capacity of personnel to staff those beds. And just imagine if the COVID epidemic had had double the fatality rate that it does, or it had been particularly severe like most flus are among the young. We would have been in deep, deep trouble in terms of our healthcare systems. And we've got to think for the future how we expand capacity or are able to expand capacity to develop surge capacity if it is needed. COVID isn't the only major disruption. Of course, climate change is having its impact monthly around the world in terms of devastating health events, devastating weather events, and other consequent health consequences. And of course, you in Sydney are all too familiar with the disasters of the fires last year, which not only affected the people who had to evacuate, the people who died, but also left Sydney blanketed in toxic smog. And we're seeing that again in California, and the long-term health effects may be actually much, much larger than the short-term major disruptive health effects. I used to hear about disruption mainly in the context of the phrase disruptive innovation. And the economists often pointed to this as a good thing, new technologies replacing old. So there could be some silver linings in here. In the UK, for instance, we switched a lot of medical consultations to video consultations, which are clearly inadequate for all purposes, but may improve access to doctors for relatively minor ailments and standard consultations. It may also help us do something about the paucity of medical personnel in rural and disadvantaged areas. The move to renewables, which is obviously absolutely key to preventing the Earth getting even hotter, also has substantial co-benefits if we switch away from fossil fuels and stop putting fine particulate matters in the air, which have those long-term respiratory and cardiovascular health effects. So there may be some small silver linings in all of this, and we've got to seek those out and celebrate and expand them. But we've really got to make sure that in doing that, we don't revert to our old model of neoliberal, market-driven forces that have so degraded our resiliency and capacity in healthcare over the last couple of decades and have led to divisions in society and greater inequality, leading to greater inequality in health, life expectancy. We've got to build back better is the old phrase. And I hope in the course of your session today, I wish you a very lively discussion. I wish I could be there. But thank you for allowing me to offer these opening remarks about the disruptive events of the last 18 months. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Hunter. So we've now gone from floods and fires and mouse plagues to global pandemics. And so a great moment to introduce our panel and to welcome each and every one. Can I start with Professor Sharon Goldfeld, who's a paediatrician. She's a public health physician. She holds many senior roles at Murdoch Children's Research Institute and the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. Professor Goldfeld has a career interest in policy-focused public health. With a decade of experience in state government, she's been a very important voice in Victoria during the current pandemic. She's focused on investigating, testing and translating sustainable solutions that eliminate inequalities for Australia's children. And she was recently awarded the inaugural Miles Medal in recognition of her research impact. So Professor Sharon Goldfeld, welcome. It's a delight that you're here.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. Our second panel member has also been a very important player during the current and previous pandemics. Noor Shanino is a founding member and the managing director of the Umbutso project. He's worked in the advocacy and community development sector over the last decade. His lived experience with the difficulties faced by young people in education and in transition to employment. Noor has advocated for improved services for youth and culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And that's led him to adopt facilitator and consultant roles with government and not-for-profit organisations, and to be a very trusted voice in his community and beyond, importantly beyond, through this last phase of the pandemic. So welcome, Noor.
Thank you.
And can I welcome Biami Williamson, Leah Mann from Gaduga in northwest New South Wales. Biami is a research associate and PhD candidate at the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at Australian National University. He holds a Masters of Indigenous Governance from the University of Victoria in British Columbia in Canada. And Biami's experience and focus is on the impact of disasters on Indigenous people and the importance of cultural land management and cultural burning to minimise disaster risk. So a timely and important voice. Welcome, Biami.
Thanks, Lee.
And our final panel member is also a very widely respected paediatrician. Professor Fiona Russell has qualifications in public health and epidemiology. She's particularly interested in vaccination. She completed her PhD evaluating vaccine schedules for infants in Fiji. Her PhD findings informed a position paper by the World Health Organization. Professor Russell has undertaken multiple consultancies for the WHO, for UNICEF, for Australian Aid, and to accelerate progress toward the Millennium Development Goals of reducing child mortality, improving maternal health. So it's a delight to welcome you, Professor Fiona Russell.
Thank you, Glenn.
So I will, if I may, start just by going around the panel and just inviting just a couple of comments on what we've heard from Shane and the general difficulties of responding to crises and the difficulties of recognising the psychological and emotional impacts that they have on all of us. But Sharon, I wonder if you would like to reflect on what you drew from Shane's comments.
Well, first of all, can I just say I'm also coming from the land of the Bunurong people and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. But also to say Shane's got such a great title. I just love that the office exists, that there's, with all the caveats that you bring around the word resilience, Shane, and I get that completely. It's still pretty cool that there is an office of resilience. And I think it goes to this kind of dissonance isn't quite the right word, but tension, I guess, in us thinking particularly about children, because I think there will be a really high level of resilience in a number of children and adolescents, actually, and their parents. And I think there's this really real moment in time as we emerge out of the pandemic where we'll see lots of children have these extraordinary learnings that they would never have had we not had a pandemic, that they'll have learned about themselves and their own sense of resilience, that they have learned skills that perhaps they would not have learned had we not had a pandemic, and in particular in areas that we've had the remote learning. And what does that mean for self-regulation? What does that mean for one's ability to think through problem solving? What does it mean on getting on with each other? So there'll be skills, I think, that children will have thought about and learned, and stories they'll be able to tell their own children and grandchildren that perhaps we hadn't thought about. But the flip side of that is there'll be children, adolescents and families who have not done so well. And we're already seeing some of those emerging, certainly during this acute phase. We've been doing this poll through the Royal Children's Hospital, where we've been polling parents across Australia, and we kind of did it and it's been led through the Royal Children's Hospital. It was done in June last year, in September last year, and then in July this year. And you'll realise, of course, various stages of lockdown during that period. And what was really clear was there's these kind of cumulative impact of lockdown on families. And by the time we got to July of this year, where we had New South Wales and Victoria essentially in lockdown, we had 60% of parents saying that they were having mental health difficulties. And so you kind of got this kind of acute phase with lots of, I think, mental health and financial stress that's happening. And I guess the question that's yet unanswered is what's going to happen on the other side of that. And I guess we'll talk about some of those things that we might be able to do when and as we emerge from the pandemic.
Thank you, Sharon. Noor, you've lived with the consequences of the COVID pandemic, including communities in Victoria that have been locked down through the crisis. Could you give us your view on resilience, on how the emotional and psychological impacts of these events are going to have played out and will play out?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I also want to start off by recognizing traditional owners, Ryan, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. Yeah, well, I think, and I was just, as Shane was going through, or Commissioner Fitzsimmons, I should say, was going, thank you, I'll stick with Shane then. Resilience, it's a word we've used a lot. Our own name, Ubuntu, which is actually a Zulu word from South Africa, which means there's actually no direct translation. There's a whole philosophy, and I won't get into what the whole philosophy is, but it's kind of the idea of I am because we are. And interestingly enough, Nelson Mandela used it as his slogan in his election. And the idea behind it is I can only succeed if people around me are successful. I can only be truly happy if people around me are happy. And I think resilience speaks a lot to that. And I just, agreed so much with what Shane said, especially around what does that mean to go back to normalcy, and I think sometimes if it is some sort of normalcy, it'll be a different normalcy. But I just connected so much with some of the examples he used, and I found it interesting how he's maybe talking about people in New South Wales and smaller towns and farm areas. And there's so much so much in relation to what I'm dealing with, working with people in public housing, in metropolitan inner city areas. And I'm paraphrasing what he said here, but that whole idea of shame of getting help or asking for help and reaching out, that's a brick wall that we've always been coming up against. And sometimes families, by the time people get over that hump, it's gotten so dire. There's so much help that they need. It's just become that much harder to try to find help and support. And I did mention earlier on, just before we jumped on here, how I've seen just how mentalities have been changing over the past 18 months at least. And the communities we're working with are the ones that went into COVID on the back foot. Public housing residents, there was already over 50% unemployment. A lot of that employment that did exist was around casual part-time service-based jobs. There's actually no data for what that number is now. But I think the flip side of that is there's been a lot of community outreach. There's been a lot of connections happening. Obviously increase of services, and the hard lockdown we had at Flemington and North Melbourne 9 towers over a year ago now led to senior bureaucrats coming in and sitting in virtual, obviously, meetings with residents and hearing things they've never heard before. And I heard department heads being told, what have you been doing for 20 years? Or being asked, what have you been doing for 20 years? Which really made my day, to be honest, to hear that question being asked by senior bureaucrats. Yeah, I'm not sure if I really answered your question, but it's been a complicated, long journey. Again, as Shane said, there's just so much happened, and we've recently had an earthquake down here too, so that's adding to the mix.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, alongside your academic expertise in disasters and their consequences for Indigenous peoples, you've actually been locked down yourself with a very young family in Western New South Wales. How do you respond to the question of the emotional and psychological costs and consequences of a crisis like this?
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. And it's wonderful to be part of this really astute panel. Just acknowledging that I'm coming from my own Ngurumba, from Gaduga, my little home camp out in northwest New South Wales. This is my grandmother's country. The fact that I can live and work from home and bring up my family out here on my home country is an opportunity that didn't exist pre-COVID. So it's important to understand that not just kind of disasters, but how these events fundamentally change society and the opportunities that they open up as well. In terms of, I guess, psychological distress and the research that I've been involved with. So I did a lot of research working with and understanding the experiences of Aboriginal people impacted by the bushfires. And it's really interesting intellectually to think about the bushfires and how they impacted Aboriginal people and look at the COVID outbreak in Western New South Wales. And what we see is two very different types of disasters unfolding against the very same entrenched inequalities and producing the same results for Aboriginal people. So we're seeing not just the way communities are affected by COVID, like this one all-encompassing community, but communities within communities and the different consequences that exist for those communities within communities. So just kind of exploring that, teasing it out and highlighting how important it is to have Aboriginal people embedded in planning and preparation for these disasters and and the absolute disastrous consequences when our people are left out of those processes. So, yeah, looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. And Professor Fiona Russell, Fiona, you've been a really important voice in trying to inject a tone of realism and evidence into public conversation around the consequences, particularly for children, but not just. How do you think the emotional and psychological toll of the last 18 months will play out, and how have we gone in managing it?
Yes, no, thank you very much to the organisers, for the invitation to come to have a chat about this, extremely important topic. And also I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm sitting today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and also pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And I'm, it's interesting because I actually work in global child health. Normally that's my day job, but in the last year, 18 months, I've been thrown into sort of domestic COVID issues for Australian children. For the first 2 decades, for the past 2 decades, I haven't done that. So, but really, I think. Certainly from my global hat, and Shane, I must say I really resonated a lot with what you said, and thank you for your talk and your presentation, and just reflecting on it myself. I was at the time of the bushfires. I was actually in Europe and was there for 6 weeks on a sabbatical, and then having a holiday. And I was actually in Munich at the time of when the Malakuta evacuation sort of was happening, and the flames, the photos of the flames were on the front page of the German newspapers. And, obviously I couldn't read anything in German, but it was just a horror, from afar. And you see how other countries are responding to what's happening, to our country. And what I really realized that we all, obviously, Brianna, Indigenous people have always had such thousands of years of a deep connection to the land, but we all have. I was brought up in the country, so I have I've got a very deep connection to the land, and felt extremely emotional about to see my country burning, and on the front page of newspapers around the world, and on the BBC and things, and what. It was interesting, what happened. I'd have conversations with the people that I was working in London at the time, and they said they could not believe that Australians volunteer to fight flames and fight for other people's burning houses, for people that they've never even met, and put their own lives at risk. And as you've said in your talk, Shane, and there were so many lives lost. So, I mean, we have to really reflect on that and think, we have got a wonderful country in many regards. I mean, we've got lots of problems as well, but I certainly had that feeling last year in Victoria as well, where, in our awful lockdown that we had for so long, and it was just so horrible and hard. But certainly as Victorians, I felt as if we had a real sense of purpose, and we were really doing this, and we felt a real exhilaration, I think, when we came out the other side, that we actually all had suffered together, and we all had a contribution, as every single individual, we have a contribution to make to fighting our current disaster, which is the pandemic. And certainly, for me as an individual, I've had to reflect on what can I contribute to COVID? I'm educated, I'm intelligent. Obviously, it's my background, infectious diseases, but most of my work is in the region, and I can't travel to the region. I can't provide the usual support that I would like to do. So, supporting partners who are at the coalface and supporting other people do this work through information and knowledge and facts, or at least describing the uncertainty that we have, because in this uncertain world and things are changing and we're learning as we go, and trying to communicate that in a way that for people then to make their own decisions and try to make the best decisions that can be made. But I think going forward, and just reflecting on the Pacific, I mean, as we know, the Pacific is the most vulnerable for climate change, and very dependent on the international community, their livelihoods, their homes, natural disasters, the disruption of the fishing industry, food, etc., is all under threat with climate change. And every year they have disasters with infectious diseases. They have dengue, some countries have malaria. And so this is all will get worse as well. And so, and Vanuatu is actually the most disaster-prone state of natural disasters in the world. And during the pandemic, Fiji not only had to deal with, the COVID situation, but 4 extreme weather events. There were cyclones, there were floodings, displacement. That in addition to COVID. So it's an extremely, and Australia is certainly supporting countries in our region to adapt. But really, we have to look at the root cause of all of this. And the root cause is our coal industry and sustainable energy. And we really need to, as Shane has said, we can't go back. We can't go back to the way things were. We have to, and be in the same situation when this hits next year, which will hit. I mean, every year the Pacific has another disaster or 2 or 3. So we have to address and move on. And similarly, there's been a huge disruption of routine health services in low and middle income countries in our region. So people are either too scared to go because they don't want to catch COVID from the hospital. And so what we found in Fiji is that people who had COVID were actually dying at home because they were too scared to go to the hospital because they didn't, or they didn't have the information. So it's extremely important that, these routine services aren't cut as well, which, certainly in our global and sustainable development goal sense, is an enormous setback for children, in particular maternal and child health, in terms of achieving our targets by 2030. So having that resilience, I think, is incredibly important. And I think I echo Sharon. I think a New South Wales department in that is amazing. And I just hope that we'll certainly need a lot of that for Victoria and the rest of the nation and our region as well as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. And not surprisingly, Shane's presentation and your responses have triggered quite a number of questions on the Q&A, which is fabulous. I'd like to pick up one from Helen Sosi, if I may, which is really interesting. So, Shane, she's interested in asking you and then getting a reflection from Noor and Biami in particular, but of course from anyone on the panel, around how in the future we build community voice into a response, how community becomes part of the response, in particular when communities' views aren't necessarily acceptable or welcomed by government. And I know that as a senior public servant that could be challenging, but it's an interesting reflection on what happens when the local view is quite starkly different from the state or national view.
Oh, thanks, Glenn. And look, I think my standing position is the best led anything is that which is locally led. So whether it's local planning, whether it's local operations, local response, or local recovery, the thing is, how do we build and ensure we've got that capacity and capability at the local level? And then particularly for organisations like mine, or indeed the broader management effort, is that how do we put in place the architecture that's got the rigor and the robustness, but the flexibility and the nuance available to it, to ensure the right facilitation, enablement, empowerment, and support. And what we've also got to remind ourselves is, I grew up in a volunteer organisation, so learning to work with and be part of a community is really important. And you can't achieve anything if you don't understand and hear what the local voice is, what the local priority is, what the local need is. And even one of the great attributes of our Aussie culture is, and particularly espoused by our volunteers, is if they don't feel they're contributing, if they don't feel their contribution is worthwhile, that they're being heard, that they're making a difference, then they've got this wonderful ability to tell you get stuff, and they'll go somewhere else where they think they can make that positive difference. And the same in the recovery aspects. We've got multi-billion-dollar programs rolling out across the place right now for fire and flood recovery alone, and there'll be more coming with the COVID. But how do we make sure that architecture recognises that what matters and is of priority in one community is invariably very different to another community? And the other thing that's really important to acknowledge is that everybody individually and collectively at a local level and at a broader community level they will approach recovery with different appetites, with different readiness, with different acceptance of when it's time to put the hand up and say, I'm ready to move forward. 18 months after fires, we're still getting people coming through for the first time to say, I'm now comfortable to have a conversation around what support and assistance and progress looks like. You can't force help on people. You can't force support on people. You can encourage and guide and reassure, but you've got to be ready to hear and understand and nuance what's required to the local level. I've been part of some pretty remarkable work just in the COVID response into focus LGAs around Sydney, where connection with local voice, whether it's cultural, religious, language, ethnicity, partner organisations, individuals, nuancing strategy and requirements into those areas. Western and far western New South Wales, and the Army will be able to talk more authoritatively on this, but connecting with Aboriginal affairs, land council groups, local community leaders, different community leaders, not necessarily Indigenous, but a lot of them are particularly Indigenous. So how do we connect and join those up and find the right people that are reflective of that local representation, not necessarily the loudest voice?
Nora, if I am, because we are, what does a good community response to a crisis like the one we're living through look like?
It's hard to answer. I don't know if I've actually seen a good response yet. I've seen some where some things worked out. The way we got involved in the response in the towers, so initially there was, out of the local mosque, there was a separate community response from the services and things like that. And what I like to refer to as weaseled our way in, just knowing the building, growing up in the area. So I lived in Flemington for 20 years, still got family there. My colleague Ahmed still lives in North Melbourne. I live still in North Melbourne. So we grew up at the community centre that ended up being the command centre, and we knew it better than anyone and took a lap, and we knew that there was an office at the back that past the storage rooms and the toilets no one knew about. And the lights were off. And we just leveraged some relationships from City of Melbourne because it was their building that was using emergency response. And it didn't officially say we could go in there, but we kind of made it look like they did the next day. And initially, no one wanted us there. Department of Health and everybody, and I'm sure, and I understood it because they're trying to control comms, to control information and all this kind of stuff. And I think it was about the next day at lunchtime, we had a long line outside our office because they realized these people are valuable. Very simple example was they heard that a family was sort of in need, that was in the lockdown, was in need of medical support, but they couldn't send anyone up to a building to check on them. They had no contact details. And they came in and said, hey, household number 33. I said, I don't know them, give me 5 minutes. And I called another mother that we knew from the soccer program on that floor, said, the residents at 33, what's their background? And she said, I think they're Somali. I said, thank you. Hanged up, called the mother on another floor from the Somali community. I said, do you know who lives at 33? Can you give him a call? Can you just pretty much vouch for us? Because you know us really well. And can you send us their number? And, we had it within 5 minutes. But it's also the important thing, and I think this happens a lot with people sort of, when you get into a system, and what's really helped me be successful in the work I do is I never went to school for it. So I didn't come in with this is how it works mentality that I've seen from a lot of my colleagues. I came in with the idea of, what would I enjoy if I was 16 years old? If we're running a program for 16-year-old boys, and I remember one day I was brought in to consult, and when they finished presenting on their plans for a group of 16-year-old boys on the program, my feedback was, that sounds boring. Because I said, when I was 16, no way I would have sat there for that. Let's make it more fun. Let's make it more interactive. But like I said earlier, like at the end of it all, when even, we had some SAS people and other emergency services came in, I know they were going to do an evaluation on how that works. As somebody said to me not long ago, which I've been overquoting recently, is you build the relationships during the good times, not the bad times. You've got to put in the time, put in the effort, get to know who's in the community. And I'll be honest, during the response, yes, there was a lot of community participation, and sometimes that made things more difficult. Sometimes that stopped things from progressing. Sometimes you do need to be able to, it's very hard, but kind of not get too emotional, where it's, okay, we've got to come up with a response. This is the options that we do have. Sometimes, in an emergency, and I'm sure everybody here would know it better than myself, you have the options that you have. But like I said, build the relationships during the good times, allow a space for pushback. One of the great things we had down here is I think they call them the operational commander, realized, okay, we need to have meetings with these community people. So twice a day, we'd have 2 briefings with them, and we were invited to sit in the emergency response where we'd actually appoint one person to go in and out. But that all happened because everybody that was involved, some people worked for trade unions. Some people, like myself, have been community advocates and been doing consulting work with government. Some people were members of certain political parties. Like, there was relationships that existed. A lot of them ran non-profits sort of voluntarily on the side. So there was trust. So the people we were sitting down with, it wasn't like, oh, here's this random person, have a conversation about these things that it's very confidential. And, we're worried about it getting out into the media and messaging and all these things. I think my advice is there's got to be a conscious, deliberate decision on both ends. Everyone has to realize it is a process, and especially if you're dealing with, fires that are burning and houses are burning down. I can't even imagine the stress of that, which, during lockdowns and COVID, you can take a day to make a decision. I would assume that's not how it works when there's a bushfire, obviously. So build the relationships during the good time. I think everyone's going to be open to listen and understand where everyone else is coming from. Sometimes, something is not an option on the other side, not because the person sitting in front of you doesn't want to do it or doesn't care about, people or their well-being. There's a lot of other pressures that sometimes we don't understand. So it's just, I think we've got to work through it, but I think we've gotten so much better. But the recent round of lockdowns and isolation orders that we had in Melbourne showed that a lot of learnings were forgotten. A year is such a long time, I think, for some people. So what happened, same buildings, Flemington and North Melbourne, we had, I don't even know how many, but a lot of families going into isolation. And that work was almost, well, they didn't call it that, but it was subcontracts to a service provider. So it was like, well, all the learnings from last year, we're now starting from zero because they weren't there last year. So that's one way not to do it. But I'm sure Biami would have a lot more to add from a different perspective.
I think Professor Hunter touched on that as well. But no, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Biami, but as I do, just a reminder that we're very open to questions and looking forward to hearing some more from them. But Biami, you've just lived through this in Western New South Wales. You've just come out of lockdown. Can you tell us a little about community response there and this question from Helen about what do we learn about how community interacts with an agency like the one that Shane is busy establishing?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Before talking about COVID and its response, because, remembering that it is still an unfolding situation out here as well, the train has not come into the station by any means. And so we're learning as we go. But just quickly, because I think that, look, the disasters of the bushfires and COVID are really comparable examples now. And we can learn a lot by examining both of them. So just responding to that in 2 ways, the idea of communities that are prepared. The first one is so important, and it really follows on from what Noor was just talking about, engaging communities in preparation and planning. Part of my research has been looking at, in response to the fires, a lot of my research has been looking at where Indigenous peoples were represented and engaged with in the critical planning and preparation documents in this country. So we're looking at the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience, the Australian Disaster Preparedness Framework, in Victoria, the Strategic Management Action Plan, and in New South Wales, the State Emergency Management Plan. Coming up to the summer in 2019-20, Aboriginal people were completely left out of all of these documents, not even cursory mentions of their unique needs, of their unique status as native title holders, their unique rights, unique population demographic profiles, nothing. And so when you don't include people in planning and preparation, it should come as no surprise that the response is wholly inadequate and actually compounds the disaster as well. It makes worse what is already a bad situation for communities. But it's not just in the documents as well that you see the absence of Aboriginal people. Coming up to last year, we've seen to the bushfires, there was really a disturbing trend of having no Aboriginal leadership in emergency management and disaster planning in Australia more generally. This has begun to change somewhat, like in Victoria with the establishment of Bushfire Recovery Victoria. We see a distinct Aboriginal culture and healing pillar. We see an Aboriginal advisory group working alongside that agency. And in New South Wales, the Bushfire Planning Committee has designated Aboriginal positions. They didn't exist before the bushfires. But even in other critical areas and institutions in this country, in disaster preparing, like AFAC, the new Natural Hazards Research Institute, our leaders still aren't on those boards, and a lot of those organisations still don't have Aboriginal advisory groups at all. They don't have Indigenous research streams. They don't have Indigenous targeted policies. We're not there sufficiently, which is just extraordinary given our unique attachments to the land. The fact that we are rights holders, we hold a lot of land, but, we know this stuff. We've put this stuff out there, and it's just not being picked up adequately. But, and that's how you build, as Nor said, that's how you build relationships. Yeah. When a disaster hits, it's too late to build a relationship. The relationship needs to exist, and there needs to be trust that exists in those relationships. And particularly pointing out the needs of in the bushfires and out here in Western New South Wales now, it's particularly concerning because of our unique population profile. More than half of our population are babies, children, and young people, So children and young people are going to be so deeply affected by this, and we're really not across how to support Aboriginal children, babies, young people through this disaster to make sure they don't come out in a more disadvantaged position. The other second point in response to that is, including communities in response. Our communities are involved in response. When governments fail us, when NGOs fail us, our communities are the ones that look after us. Only our communities. We're in the bushfires, in COVID in Western New South Wales, our own people are the only ones that we can rely on. And that includes our community-controlled health organisations, which are just an extraordinary organisations, our local land councils, our local working parties. They're the ones that pick up the pieces, as well as our families who live in the city, who advocate, who organise, who mobilise on our behalves. Out here in Gaduga, we don't have a store. Our closest store is 45 minutes drive. So if there are serious issues of food security here in this community, and when it closed down, and our closest store, by the way, is in a different LGA. So when the lockdown hit and you can't travel outside of your LGA, what were we supposed to do? Yeah. And we've seen the extraordinary response from our families in Sydney, in Newcastle, in Canberra, in Brisbane, organising food parcels, food drops for community here. It's really overwhelming, really inspiring, and it would just be nice if that effort was matched by targeted and appropriate government policies.
Thank you very much for moving and powerful. And you mentioned children and young people. In fact, that's our next question from Galina Laurie, who's particularly interested to hear from Sharon and Fiona about what are the lessons to date about the distinctive needs of children and young people in helping them to recover immediately, but also about thinking about their future post-disaster. Perhaps Sharon and then Fiona, if you'd like to jump in.
Sure. I might just start by just reflecting where I kind of was on about the 15th of March, maybe it was a bit earlier, I think it was the 13th and 14th of March 2020. I was at a 2-day meeting about what we might do for young children, particularly focused on early childhood and how we might actually make a difference. We're actually at the hotel where the Grand Prix was being held in Victoria. For those of you who are Victorian, you'll know the Grand Prix that year got cancelled, and I think that's when it really hit people about what was happening, and things were sort of changing on a daily basis. But in the meantime, we were all 400 people packed in a room. There was a sort of slight nervousness after that as to whether or not we were a super spreader event or something, but actually we had no COVID. But at that meeting, we were all sort of sitting around thinking about, and it was multi-sectoral, really, and that's really the essence of all of this thinking, multi-sectoral, thinking about, wow, how are we going to make a difference for young people, and particularly for young children, early childhood. And at that, I was fortunate enough to be able to be a speaker at that event. And at that event, I talked about this idea of how do we do slow system change fast? How do we get this kind of sense of urgency that we need to make a difference for kids now, not kind of later, not with, that actually children are being born. There's about 250,000 children born every year in Australia. And we know that about 20% of them are going to turn up to school developmentally vulnerable on one or more of the domains of the Australian Early Development Census. And then there's about a threefold difference between the poorer areas and richer areas, pre-pandemic statistics. So it's not like we had some sort of utopian nirvana equal society beforehand. Then along comes this massive disruptive event called the pandemic, and amazing things happened for the world. But amazing things happened in Australia, and you kind of alluded to it briefly, Glenn, which was, we suddenly went and we had Job Seeker, and we suddenly gave everybody money. Like, never in our wildest dreams would we think that would happen, that government would not only double Job Seeker, but give people money. And we kind of eliminated a lot of poverty, like bang. And then we did things like telehealth, like we pivoted to telehealth in 2 weeks. This was supposed to be a 10-year strategy. And so then, then we've gone from thinking about not what could we do. It's like we can actually do anything. We could actually make a difference for children and young people. It's not whether we have the ability to do so, it's whether we have the motivation and the political will, because it's quite clear that we can do a whole range of things that we never thought possible. So on that note, I think going forward for children in particular, there is this real opportunity to start really staring in the face of the things that make a difference for kids that perhaps we haven't really properly addressed before. And if I just want to note a couple of them, Glenn, and then we can take questions later, because I don't want to keep yattering on for too long, but because I could. The first thing is this issue of addressing the issue of financial distress for families. And I really want to say that let's not kid ourselves that money doesn't make a difference for families. There's multiple randomized control trials that have shown that it does. So, wow, is this a moment in time where we talk about, and I can tell you there's a lot of families with young children that have been really just making ends meet during this pandemic. So this is not a problem for the very poor, which, that's a separate conversation, but it's much, much higher up the income stream. So the question is, wow, could we be doing something like a parent supplement for parents of young children? Because we know from a brain development point of view, that's when the developing brain is really very both open but vulnerable to what's happening in the family. So, wow, could we do something like that and just stare those social determinants in the face? Then, wow, number 2, I want to talk about the importance of school. So those of you who are educationalists or who have got children in school, nothing I'm going to say to you is kind of going to blow you off your chair, but there are these moments. So number 1, health is not the main game for children. Schools and early childhood, they are the main game. This is where kids go. 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, 40 weeks a year, 13 years of their life. More exposure than anything else we have in the service system. And yet we've got pretty unequal outcomes. So 2 things happened with the pandemic. First of all, turns out schools are about much more than reading and writing and numeracy. Anybody involved with schools knows that. But, maybe externally we didn't. Turns out that's where children are safe. That's where they have all their social and emotional development. And that plays a huge role in the developmental trajectories of children that has much more than just about that kind of curriculum development. And what we found was that children were not as safe as they could be during the pandemic, that there were no eyes on children. And this is in particular, I'm talking from the lockdown point of view in particular, when children weren't at school, there were no eyes on children and things were happening behind closed doors that nobody knew about. So 2 things were happening. Number 1, there was issues around child neglect and child abuse. But number 2 is there was learning problems, like kids who did not have access to internet, to tablets or to devices, all the things that many of us take for granted. The outcomes of all of that, we don't know all those data yet. We haven't got all those data yet, but that's going to be that long tail of COVID. So here's the thing. Maybe it's time to reconceive what we think about at school. Maybe schools aren't really about just learning, but much more holistic and much more about places that we can be much more multidisciplinary and much more thinking about, well, maybe it's not about NAPLAN. Maybe it's about children's health and well-being as much as it is about their numeracy and literacy. And then the third thing is just to say, we've got to move away from these kind of way we deliver services now, which is, here I am, I've opened my door. If you can make it to me, I'm here. And move much more into what's our integrated approach to service delivery, what's the use of digital platforms for reaching into people's homes. Telehealth has taught us that we can do that. And we have to move away from ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. You know, we are being crippled at the moment in terms of our mental health care system. You know, Fiona and I have been talking about this a lot. We talk a lot about the hospitals being overwhelmed and our ICUs being overwhelmed. Well, our mental health ICUs were overwhelmed months ago. And, you know, we don't really talk about that in that way. We don't talk about the number of kids who are being admitted to hospital with mental health problems. We don't talk about the fact that you can't get a mental health appointment for love or money. So I think there's time to start saying we can't keep just, you know, parking ambulances at the bottom of a cliff. We've got to be preventive. All right, I'm going to stop now, Glenn, because I told you I'd go on for a while.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. And so much to take in there. Really important messages. Fiona, if I may turn to you on this question of, in particular for young people, around immediate response, but also the future.
Yes, no, thank you, Glenn. And just as I sort of mentioned before, I haven't been involved in domestic stuff except for the last year. And what completely shocked me was when Sharon said, well, you know, children's voices are never taken into account in policy. Who's ever talking about the children? And we can see that just panning out here in Australia, and, you know, our state decisions last year when COVID came. You know, when we didn't know much about it, we thought, oh gosh, we have to shut the schools and everything because we don't know how much it's going to affect children. And so when it was very obvious that, you know, children, you know, by and large, it's a very mild thing and we don't have to worry too much about COVID in them, the schools were still shut. And the schools were shut because then there was the fear that children would spread it to their grandparents and everybody, and you know, they were basically going to kill off their grandparents. And so, and then that was proven to be, you know, fairly wrong too, that children last year, you know, prior to the Delta, weren't the main transmitters of the virus. And so we've made very bad decisions for children in 2020, by and large, and Sharon's outlined why the closure of schools was so bad, but certainly from a infection point of view, it's the same issue. We should have learned from that, and we should have learned from that. But in 2021 we hadn't, and then Delta came along and shot everything out of, you know, it changed everything again, unfortunately. But we're still in a situation where COVID, you know, for the vast majority of children, well, for half of them, you don't even get any symptoms. And then the other half will get a cold. And by and large, it's an extremely mild condition for them. And so, so that's sort of one issue. But the issue is who's making decisions for children, and in every policy decision and every community decision, somebody needs to be talking for the children, and similarly for the adolescents. There need to be adolescent voices in the decisions that are being made for them. It's absolutely critical that adolescents are sitting at the table about their decisions. And then when I look in the global sort of sense and our regional sort of sense, what's happening there for children and adolescents, and again, it's coming to what Shane has said about, you know, all the prior problems. I mean, the prior problems haven't gone away, and they're even worse. And so, you know, what kills kids around the world in our region is pneumonia, and it's not from COVID, it's from other viruses and other bacteria, and there is a vaccine for that. You know, there is a vaccine for that, but and Pfizer, in fact, has a fantastic vaccine. They've had that vaccine for 20 years, but vast majority of countries in our region can't afford it because it's $140, you know, $180 a dose. And so for countries in our region, particularly the middle income countries, you know, the middle class families, which is 30%, can pay for that vaccine. So the well-off 30% get their babies vaccinated. But for the other 70%, which are the poorest, and pneumonia is a disease of poverty, by and large, they're not vaccinated. So they end up with the poorest outcomes. And similarly, diarrhea, vaccine to prevent that, not implemented. Cervical cancer, HPV, vaccine for that, not implemented. Why? Because it costs too much. So we've got all these things, and we've got, you know, the biggest reasons why babies die in Papua New Guinea, which has the worst indicators in the world. is because of infections that pass from mother to baby in the early newborn period. And similarly, this is another issue again for our Indigenous babies as well, is in their ear health, is that passing through of these infections to newborns as well. But we don't have vaccines for that either. And so there's all these neglected conditions, all these neglected health problems. And not only there's the health system, there's not even oxygen. So when you are sick, there's no oxygen in the health centre or the hospital to treat you. And so you die because you don't have access to the most basic of treatments or antibiotics. So these are the things that absolutely have to be, the things, the disasters pre-existing COVID that have only been exacerbated by COVID and absolutely have to be invested in for the future of children, and certainly, making sure that the people with the voice who are talking about children and are at the table as well is absolutely critical.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sadly, we are moving toward the close, but an important question from Jack Heath, who's the CEO of Philanthropy Australia, and perhaps a chance, Shane, to sum up a little about what you've heard and contributed. Jack starts by saying thank you for all you have done and all you are doing. I know something we all share, Shane, admiration for your work. He asks, how can we best combat the stigma against reaching out for help that was so central to your presentation? And how can we make sure that is addressed in future disaster responses? And that is, how do we build that mental health focus into resilience?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I think it starts with a responsibility on each and every one of us, and anyone that's got any sort of profile, it's particularly so. It starts with us as connections with family. It starts with us as our links with community. But if we're in particular roles of some profile, then we should be having open, honest conversations. And picking up on some of the comments from my colleagues, the other thing I think we've got to do is ensure that our communications is right. That when we communicate, we not only send a message out, but we're pausing and listening, but importantly hearing the messages that come back. I think Noor said, this is all about a two-way street. So you can't put all the imposition on someone else to come up with the solutions. It's about how do we join together and come together as bodies, as communities, as individuals, as families. How do we come together to socialize issues, problems and issues socialized with many are more often than not the most challenging. And indeed, if we socialise with many and we truly invest in mutual respect, we get solutions back much more readily because people will be open to contribute. They will know that they'll be heard, that they know that they'll be connected with. I think the other reality is, and there's a phrase I like to use, and pardon my crudeness, but it's actually about being as authentic as we can be. So if we're dealing with the dog poop sandwich, don't think that we can sprinkle it in hundreds and thousands and convince everyone it's fairy bread, because they'll work through it really quickly and understand that there's a big difference. So I think as we lead with conviction, and leadership is a shared responsibility at every level, if we can lead by example and open up and invite the conversations and factor it into the narrative. I can see it now. There's a couple of words I won't use. I won't use the phrase Black Summer bushfires, but I don't use the phrase social distancing. I get it. I understand it. I know where all the medicos came from. But we're talking about physical distancing. And now more than ever, we've got to talk about encouraging social connection, social cohesion, albeit we might be doing it virtually. So the more we can reach out and be very deliberate and nuanced with our language and our messaging, be really clear and open about what we're trying to say, but leading with example is really important. Factoring into priority strategies. Same with recovery. Most people, when they talk about recovery, they think about rebuilding, they think about repair, they think about reconstruction, building all the things, the bridges, the homes, the buildings, the infrastructure. The word we leave out over and over again in recovery is healing. So whenever I use the word recovery, I talk about recovery and healing. And if we're intervening in operations, we're talking about relief and recovery, because there's all these human dimensions behind every statistic, behind every bit of thing we build. It's of no value if it's not helping and supporting people, and we're relying on people to build it in any case. So healing becomes central to nearly all that we're doing, and whether that's healing ourselves as community, healing the environment, and looking ahead about building resilience so we're stronger and wiser. And I think the professor said, Professor Hunter, in the initial phases, I'm actually really pleased to see now the realisation of betterment funding post-disaster and disruption, not just building back the same thing and the same arrangements and the same infrastructure. How do we learn and actually invest in betterment at that time? So it starts with all of us, and it starts through, I think, leading through example and making sure the conversation is normalised. If we can be our true self and be authentic, that helps build empathy. It helps build trust relationships, and you're giving permission to people to open up a little bit more because they're not going to be judged. The old phrase, you can't be what you can't see. So if you can see it, you might have a chance of being it.
Shane, thank you very much. And look, there's so much more that I'd like to ask our panellists, and so would our audience, but this part of the webinar, sadly, we'll have to draw to a close. Many of our panellists and many of our audience are staying on for some virtual table conversations, which I hope will give a chance to think about the systematic issues and also the future trajectories that come out of these conversations. And there'll just be a short, for those who are staying on, just a short pause while the details come up on the screen. But to close this event and to say a profound thanks to our panel. It's just been a superb panel, and it's just been so engaging listening to them. I'd like to invite Michael Trail, who's the chair of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, to offer some final remarks.
Thanks so much, Glenn, and thanks so much to the panellists and Shane particularly for your practical and grounding and inspiring words. One of the points in putting this series together for the Foundation on Disrupting Disadvantage was that we find ways to connect during this very different and challenging period of time. And thank you so much also, Glenn, for that extremely able facilitation. And like many of those of us on the call with the Foundation hat on, there are some very headline takeaways for me. I was particularly taken by what Shane said and Fiona referred to as the idea that we can't just bounce back to a normal, and the idea that we go back to that is a bit of a false premise. And I think some of the clues and the takeaways for us as a foundation, I'm particularly minded of Shane's entreaty that we do seriously and thoughtfully and compassionately the little things. And as a kid who grew up in regional Victoria in a country community, the messages that come through incredibly strongly about respect, understanding, and being deeply grounded in community voice, I think sit at the heart of the mission. And listening particularly to Barmy and Noor share their own experiences of what happens in community if we don't, given the scale and scope of what we've got to do, if we don't do that thoughtfully and sensitively and well, we know that we won't achieve what we aim to do. So we really appreciate the challenges and insights from the panel. We'll take those away. There's much to digest, and thank you so much for your engagement with us. It's been deeply appreciated. Back to you, Glenn.
Michael, thank you. And I join you in thanking Shane and Sharon and Noor and Biami and Fiona for just a fabulous discussion. Thank you for those who are staying on. And as I say, if you're pre-registered, at the time you joined us, all of that should happen fairly shortly. But great conversation, lots to follow up on this. But to everyone who's been part of this, to our audience, to our wonderful speakers, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.